Have you ever, like, been reading the Bible and thought, hold on a sec, this is weird. Like,
Yeah.
there's this whole other side of things going on that you just aren't seeing.
Totally.
You're not alone. And in fact, that's exactly what we're going to explore in this deep dive today.
Right.
We're going to journey into the supernatural worldview that's presented in Scripture.
Yeah.
The stuff that's often, like, skipped over or kind of pushed aside.
Yeah.
But it turns out it's really super important.
That's right. We're going to be taking a look at what might seem like the more unusual territories of the Bible.
Yeah.
But as our guide for this deep dive, Dr. Michael Heiser convincingly shows us that these so-called strange parts are often absolutely essential
Right.
to understand the big picture of the whole narrative.
Yeah. We're going to be basing our exploration today on his Supernatural Seminar Part 1 video from AWKNG Inc. And, even if you think you have a pretty good grasp of the Bible,
Right.
this deep dive might just unlock some serious aha moments for you.
I think so.
Because we're really talking about looking past centuries of interpretation
Yeah.
to get a glimpse of the original context.
Absolutely.
Now, just a heads up, some of these ideas might be new to you.
Sure.
Maybe even a little bit unexpected.
Right.
But just stick with us.
Yeah, trust the process.
Yeah. So just to give you a bit of background on Dr. Heiser.
Sure.
He earned his doctorate from the University of Wisconsin,
Okay.
and he spent years teaching at the Bible college level. And he's the author of several books, including Unseen Realm and Supernatural.
Great books.
And he also hosts the Naked Bible podcast.
Yeah. Great podcast.
He's really passionate about setting aside our modern assumptions.
Right.
And trying to understand Scripture through the eyes of the original human authors and their audience.
Oh, for sure.
He talks about how there was this one moment for him that was a real turning point.
Right.
When he was reading Psalm 82 in the original Hebrew.
Wow.
And that's actually where we're going to start our deep dive today.
Okay, fantastic.
Because our mission today is to explore the biblical understanding of this supernatural realm.
Right.
Specifically focusing on this concept of a divine council.
Right.
And the reality of other spirit beings alongside the one true God.
So other Elohim.
Right. But we want to do this in a way that really deeply respects our core theological foundations. The gospel, the Trinity,
Of course.
the Lordship of Christ.
Absolutely.
But while also investigating some interpretations that might be really new for you.
Okay, so Psalm 82.
Yes.
This psalm was like a major watershed moment for Dr. Heiser.
Yeah.
It really transformed his view of the supernatural in Scripture.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Absolutely.
So why was Psalm 82 so important?
Well, it really all hinges on the very first verse.
Okay.
It says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment.
Okay, so right away, that word God, that's the Hebrew word Elohim, right?
That's right.
And what really struck Dr. Heiser was the second part of that verse.
In the midst of the gods. And guess what? It's the same Hebrew word, Elohim.
Wow.
But this time, it's plural.
So there are other Elohim.
Right. So the Bible's telling us from the get-go that God is sovereign within a structure, a spiritual realm.
Yeah.
Not like he's off by himself.
Right. This has huge implications for how we understand God's authority in the context of his actions.
Right. And I think what's really interesting about that phrase, in the midst of, is what it implies.
Yeah.
You can't be in the midst of something that's singular.
Right.
It suggests that there's like a group, a gathering.
It suggests that there's a plurality there.
Right. Yeah.
So the verse is literally saying that God is standing
Yeah.
in the middle of other beings
Yeah.
who are also designated as Elohim.
Right. So for the original Israelite audience, they're living in a world that's surrounded by all these cultures that worship many gods.
So for them to hear that term Elohim being used for both their God and these other beings, it would have been like a really significant distinction.
Right.
To emphasize Yahweh's unique power and authority.
Right. Even though they're sharing that same term.
Right. And it gets even more interesting.
Yeah, tell me more.
As you read on into verses 2 through 7, you see God actually judging these other gods.
Whoa.
He's calling them out for their unjust rulings, for showing favoritism to the wicked, for failing to protect the vulnerable.
This is serious stuff.
Yeah. And then he says this really direct statement in verse 6.
Okay.
I said, you are gods. Again, that's Elohim. All of you sons of the Most High. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die.
Wow. So they're not immortal.
Right. So you have this image of God in a council with other beings
Yeah.
who are called Elohim and
Right.
sons of the Most High.
Mhm.
And these beings are clearly accountable to him
Yeah.
and can even die. So Dr. Heiser really emphasizes that this is not talking about the Trinity,
Right.
because the Trinity is not going to be judged by God for being corrupt
Uh-huh.
or facing death, right?
Oh, right.
So we have this really vivid picture here of God presiding over a council of other Elohim,
Mm-hmm.
who are also termed sons of the Most High,
Yeah.
and they're subject to divine scrutiny
Mm-hmm.
and even death.
Right. So if these beings are judged and can die,
Yeah.
doesn't that sort of challenge our traditional understanding of what it means to be divine?
Right. And I know what some of you might be thinking right now.
Yeah.
The more common interpretation that you might have heard
Uh-huh.
is that these gods in Psalm 82
Yeah.
aren't actually supernatural beings at all,
Right.
but rather they're referring to human leaders.
Yeah, like maybe Jewish elders,
Right, Jewish elders.
members of the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
Or even just like the people of Israel collectively.
Right, and that was the traditional understanding that Dr. Heiser really wrestled with too.
Yeah.
But he came to find this interpretation problematic,
How so?
especially when he looked at how Jesus himself referenced Psalm 82.6.
Oh, interesting. How did Jesus use that verse?
So during a discussion with the Jewish leaders,
Yeah.
Jesus quotes that line, "I said you are gods."
Wow.
But Dr. Heiser points out that Jesus wasn't saying, hey, we're all divine here.
Yeah.
Let's not make a fuss.
Right.
He wasn't putting himself on the same level as these religious authorities
Right.
by any means.
Right. He wasn't saying that everyone's a god.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Instead, Jesus was using that verse to show that
Right.
even within their own scriptures,
Uh-huh.
there were other beings that were called gods. So
Right.
basically his argument was,
Yeah.
if your own scriptures use this term for others,
Mhm.
why are you accusing me of blasphemy when I claim to be the Son of God?
That's a great point. So he was acknowledging the existence of this category
Right.
of divine beings. He wasn't like democratizing divinity for everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
Right.
So we've seen that this traditional interpretation
Mm-hmm.
of Psalm 82 is referring to human leaders
Yeah.
really has some problems,
Yeah.
especially when we consider how Jesus used that passage.
Right. So if they're not human,
Yeah.
if they're not just human leaders or the people of Israel,
Where else in Scripture do we find this idea
right.
of a heavenly council?
Right. So if these gods aren't human leaders,
Mhm.
then where can we find them in the Bible?
Right.
Well, let's take a look at Psalm 89.
All right, let's do it.
So Psalm 89, verses 5 through 7, offers some really compelling support
Okay.
for this idea.
Right.
It talks about the heavens praising God's faithfulness
Mm-hmm.
in the assembly of the holy ones.
Okay.
And then it poses these rhetorical questions.
Mm-hmm.
For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord?
Yeah.
Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord, a God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones?
Okay, that's interesting.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
That phrase, heavenly beings, in verse 6,
Mm-hmm.
if you're looking at the English Standard Version, it actually includes a footnote
Okay.
that says that the Hebrew word there
Right.
translates to sons of God.
Oh, wow. So you have this assembly of the holy ones, this
Right.
council of the holy ones,
Mm-hmm.
and they're explicitly called sons of God,
Right.
and they're in heaven.
Right.
So if we connect this back to Psalm 82,
Yeah.
where the Elohim are also called sons of the Most High,
Yeah.
it really raises this question. How can these sons of God, who are ruling in the heavens,
Right.
be the same as earthly Jewish leaders?
Right. It seems like a real disconnect.
It does, doesn't it?
And this concept of a heavenly council,
Yeah.
it's not just some abstract poetic
Yeah,
image. We
right.
actually see it depicted in action,
Oh,
in
really?
a historical narrative,
Okay, where do we see that?
in 1 Kings 22.
Okay, 1 Kings 22. Let's
Mhm.
check it out.
This is a really fascinating passage that really brings this idea to life.
Right.
It's set during the period of the divided kingdoms,
Okay.
with King Ahab ruling Israel in the north
Mm-hmm.
and King Jehoshaphat ruling Judah in the south.
Right, so the kingdom's been split into
right.
north and south.
Right. So Ahab is seeking an alliance with Jehoshaphat
Okay.
to launch an attack on Ramoth Gilead.
So he wants to go to war,
Right.
and he wants Jehoshaphat to join him.
Right.
Okay.
So Jehoshaphat agrees to meet with Ahab,
Okay.
and Ahab gathers all of his prophets,
Mm-hmm.
who of course confidently predict victory,
Of course they do.
but Jehoshaphat's a little bit more discerning,
Okay.
and he asks,
Yeah.
is there not here a prophet of the Lord of whom we may inquire.
Oh, he wants a second opinion.
Right.
Right.
And Ahab's response is pretty interesting.
What did he say?
He's like, well, there's this one guy, Micaiah,
Uh-huh.
but I hate him
All right.
because he never prophesies anything good about me.
So Ahab only wants to hear good news.
Right. But they summon Micaiah anyway.
Okay.
And at first, he's kind of sarcastic.
Really?
And he just echoes what Ahab's prophets have said.
Oh, so he's like, yeah, you guys are going to win. Totally.
But Ahab's like, no, seriously, tell me the truth.
Right, cut the crap.
Right.
What's going to happen?
Yeah, what did God actually say?
Okay.
And then Micaiah shares this incredible vision in verses 19 through 23.
All right.
He says, I saw the Lord sitting on his throne,
Mm-hmm.
and all the host of heaven standing beside him,
Okay.
on his right hand and on his left.
Mm-hmm.
And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth-Gilead?
Oh, wow.
And one said one thing and another said another.
So there's a discussion happening here.
Yeah.
Among these heavenly beings.
Right.
Wow.
It's like God's having a meeting.
Yeah, a strategy session up in heaven.
Right. And what's really important for us to see here is that God isn't portrayed as like needing this information.
Right.
But rather, he's kind of opening it up for suggestions.
Yeah, he's soliciting advice.
Right. On how to accomplish his will.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, the judgment of Ahab.
Right. So it's not like God needs help figuring out how to judge Ahab.
No.
He's already made that decision.
Right.
He's just giving the heavenly host an opportunity to participate.
Yeah, to be involved.
Wow, that's fascinating.
And then this spirit steps forward.
Okay.
And offers to become a lying spirit in the mouths of Ahab's prophets.
Whoa, a lying spirit.
I know, right?
That's a pretty shocking detail.
It really is.
And God actually gives this spirit permission to go and carry out this deception.
I know.
Wow.
It's pretty wild, right?
It is.
So Micaiah concludes by saying, Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you.
So this scene really shows us that God is actively working.
Yeah.
With members of his heavenly host.
Right.
It's not out of necessity.
No.
But it's by his choice.
Right.
He's involving these other spirit beings in his plans.
Right.
This gives us a glimpse into how the spiritual realm operates in relation to God's sovereignty.
Yeah. So this idea of order and structure within the supernatural realm seems to be a recurring theme in Scripture.
Okay.
We actually see it again in the book of Daniel.
Okay.
Specifically in chapter 7.
Right. Chapter 7, Daniel.
Yeah.
What happens there?
So Daniel's having this vision of these 4 terrifying beasts, which represent these earthly empires.
Okay.
And then in verses 9 and 10, we see a shift to the heavenly realm.
Okay.
Daniel writes, As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat.
Thrones, plural.
Right.
That's interesting. So there are multiple thrones that are being set up.
Okay.
And the description continues.
Yeah. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court, the council sat in judgment, and the books were opened.
Wow. So there's a court?
Yeah.
There's a council.
Right.
It's like a royal court.
Yeah, the language there is really intentional. It's trying to paint this picture of God as the ultimate king.
Yeah. The sovereign ruler.
Right. Surrounded by this vast number of beings.
A multitude of beings.
Right. Who are serving him and taking part in his judgments.
Wow. This just reinforces the idea that the supernatural world is not just this chaotic free-for-all.
Right.
But there is a structure.
Right.
Order.
Yeah. It's organized.
Right.
So now I want to talk about something that might be kind of unsettling for some of you.
Yeah.
This whole idea of other gods.
Yeah, other Elohim. That can be a tough concept.
Right, especially for us in the modern Western world. The idea of other gods can be kind of scary.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's because of how we've been taught to understand the word God.
Right.
We automatically connect it with this very specific set of attributes, like omniscience, omnipresence, ultimate sovereignty.
Being the sole creator.
Right, being the only creator.
Of everything.
Of everything, right?
So when we come across this idea of gods in the plural, it just clashes with how we've been taught to think about God.
With our deep-seated understanding of the one true God.
Yeah.
But Dr. Heiser argues that the biblical authors didn't think about Elohim the same way that we do.
Yeah.
They didn't think about God with that capital G the same way we do.
That's a good point.
And he points to the fact that the term Elohim is actually used in a lot of different ways throughout the Old Testament. It's not always referring to the God of Israel.
Right. It's not a title.
Yeah.
That's exclusively reserved for Yahweh.
Right.
Give me some examples.
Okay, so we've already seen how it's used to describe the council members in Psalm 82.
Right, those other Elohims.
But there's other places too, like when it talks about the gods of the surrounding nations, like Shemash of Moab or Ashtoreth.
Right, the Canaanite goddess?
Yeah.
Oh.
They're referred to as Elohim as well.
Oh, wow.
You can see that in passages like 1 Kings 11.33.
Okay.
Now, obviously, the biblical writers weren't saying that these other deities were on the same level as Yahweh, but they still use the same term for them.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So then there's that strange story of Saul and the medium of Endor.
Oh, yeah.
In 1 Samuel 28.43.
What happens there?
So the medium conjures up this spirit that she thinks is Samuel, and she tells Saul, I see a god coming up out of the earth. And again, the word there is Elohim.
Wow. So even the disembodied dead are called Elohim.
They're called Elohim.
So clearly this term wasn't limited
Right.
to beings with those unique characteristics
Right.
that we attribute to the one true God.
Right.
Because like a random dead Israelite wasn't suddenly all-powerful just because they died.
Right.
Yeah.
They weren't suddenly omnipotent.
No.
Right.
So Elohim tells us what these beings are.
Right.
Like fundamentally,
Yeah.
they're members of the spirit world.
Right.
Sons of God tells us about their position or status within God's administration. And Malach or Angelos tells us what they do.
Right.
Like their job.
Yeah.
They're messengers.
Messengers, right.
Like different titles and job descriptions within a company.
Right. Exactly.
So if Elohim doesn't automatically mean the supreme all-powerful creator.
Yeah.
What does it mean then?
Right. So if Elohim doesn't automatically mean that this being is the one true God, what does it actually mean? Well, Dr. Heiser proposes that Elohim really just means that this is a member of the disembodied spirit world.
Okay.
That's the core meaning.
So it's kind of like a category.
Yeah, it's like a category of being.
A spiritual being.
Right.
Okay.
Yahweh is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is Yahweh.
Right.
He is unique.
He's unique.
He's in a category of his own.
Right.
Or as Dr. Heiser says, species unique.
Right.
And this understanding of Elohim really leads naturally to this concept of hierarchy within the supernatural realm.
Yeah, a hierarchy of Elohim.
Right, like a divine bureaucracy, which actually has parallels in other ancient Near Eastern cultures as well.
Right. So the Israelites weren't the only ones who thought about the divine realm this way.
Right. So at the very top of this hierarchy is Yahweh.
Okay.
And he's understood as a godhead. But we're not really going to dive into the details of that today. But then, in the middle tier, you have the sons of God.
Right.
And it's important to remember that this isn't like describing their essential nature.
Right.
It's not an ontological term.
Okay.
But it's more about their role and their rank.
Okay, so it's about their function.
Yeah.
In God's government.
Yeah, in God's administration. And then below that, you have what you might call the administrative staff.
Okay.
These are beings that are defined by their specific tasks.
Like what they do.
Right, what they do.
Boy.
And that's where terms like malak in Hebrew and angelos in Greek come in.
Yeah.
They both basically mean messenger.
Right.
So it's a description of their job.
Yeah.
But not necessarily all of who they are.
Right. It's not telling you everything about that being. Right. It's just their job title.
Right. And it's interesting how this vocabulary kind of shifts in the New Testament, where terms like holy ones and sons of God often refer to believers.
Oh, wow.
Paul even says in 1 Corinthians 6.3 that we will judge angels.
Really?
Yeah, which suggests that maybe humanity has like a higher ranking in the coming kingdom than angels.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So Dr. Heiser argues that this whole idea of God having a heavenly family, a supernatural council, it's not just some random theological point. He says it's crucial for understanding God's relationship with humanity.
Absolutely. So the way God interacts with his heavenly host,
Yeah.
with this partnership,
Mm-hmm.
and this familial aspect,
Right.
this sense of identity and mission,
Mm-hmm.
that foreshadows his desire for that kind of relationship
Yeah.
with us.
Right. Okay. I know some of you are probably thinking right now,
Yeah.
but what about all those verses that say there
Yeah.
is no God besides me?
There's no other
Right.
besides me.
Doesn't that contradict this whole idea of other Elohim?
Right. Good question.
So Dr. Heiser explains that those statements are really emphasizing
Yeah.
God's absolute incomparability.
And his unique sovereignty.
So they're not necessarily denying the existence of other Elohim.
Right. Not denying that they exist,
Mm-hmm.
but they're just highlighting
Right.
that God is in a category all his own.
That he's unique.
Right.
Okay.
And he actually uses this really helpful analogy.
Okay, I like analogies.
Yeah. So he says that to think about
Mm-hmm.
when an ancient city like Babylon or Nineveh
Okay.
would declare, there is none besides me.
Uh-huh.
They weren't saying that
Right.
there weren't any other cities on the planet.
Yeah, they weren't denying the existence of other cities.
Right.
Yeah.
But they were proclaiming their own
Yeah.
greatness.
Their greatness.
And significance.
They were bragging.
Yeah, they were
Yeah.
saying, we're the best.
We're number one.
Right.
I get it.
So in the same way,
Mm-hmm.
when God declares that there is no God besides him,
Mm-hmm.
it's emphasizing his unique attributes and his supreme authority.
Okay. That makes sense. And I think another question that you might have is,
Yeah.
why would God even need a council?
Yeah, why would he need help
Right.
running the universe?
Doesn't that somehow diminish his power?
Yeah. If he's all-powerful, why does he need a team?
Right. So Dr. Heiser explains that God doesn't need a council in the sense that
Yeah.
he's lacking something.
Right.
It's not like he needs their help to figure things out,
Right.
but rather he chooses to involve them.
Yeah, he chooses to involve them in his plan.
Right.
Okay.
We saw that in the judgment of Ahab in 1 Kings 22,
Right.
and we see it again in Daniel 4
Okay.
with the judgment on Nebuchadnezzar,
Huh.
where the sentence of the watchers, which is another term for heavenly beings,
Right.
aligns with the decree of the Most High.
Okay.
So it's kind of like this. God chooses to involve us, humanity, in his work through the Great Commission.
Yeah, right. He gives us a job to do.
Right. And
Yeah.
obviously,
Yeah.
he could do it all himself.
Yeah, he doesn't.